Thanks a lot, Fabio, and all colleagues for being here. Thanks to the Géosciences department for this invitation. It's very nice to establish bridges with between the various departments here, and there is a lot of meaning for strong collaborations between the Institut de Biologie and Institut des Géosciences on this daunting topic of the connection between climate change and health, and with Aglaé, Géosciences, Fabio and others, this connection has already been established with collaborations in the context of the TRACS PEPR. So with Kevin and Fabio, we have discussed about the way to approach this very broad topic, and this talk is a balance between the somewhat methodological dimensions of this study and more content and more topical content. I will start with this curve that you all know, showing the required trajectory to try to limit climate change below a certain level. As you know, unfortunately, our societies are not on the right track, even within Europe. There are many reasons why individuals, societies do not manage to have the strong decline in greenhouse gas emissions that is required. I'm not a specialist of political sciences, but among these reasons, there might be an underestimation of the overall cost of not acting against climate change. We know also that there is preference for the present, so that acting with impacts on the climate that may take 20 or 30 years to unfold might not be motivating enough for many, and this is connected with the long half-life, atmospheric half-life of CO2. People also may have a preference for local benefits, and the benefits of climate change mitigation actions are diluted across the planet. This leads to what economists call the free rider phenomenon, according to which there is some rationality in not being the first to strongly act against climate change, and waiting for other large emitters to act before you yourself decide to act. Of course, the social inequality dimension of these issues is essential, and climate change mitigation action with perceived social inequalities are expected not to be well received by societies. You might see the Gilets jaunes movement as one illustration of a strong reaction against the social inequalities of a French carbon tax. So we have these climate change mitigation actions with rather long-term, diluted and conditional effects conditional on the fact that others act, that possibly contribute to the limited action of societies, in addition to even less rational consideration that I will not discuss here. And within our research center, we strongly believe that one way to at least partly circumvent these challenges is to consider health. Indeed, when societies will hopefully decrease their greenhouse gas emissions, they will act on sectors such as the transport, the agricultural, the building sectors, the main emitters. These sectors are all very strongly connected with health. The transport sector conditions are physical activity, conditions particulate matter emissions. Particulate matter kills 7 million people at the planetary scale. Sedentarity is also a huge public health issue. Of course, the agricultural sector conditions are diet, which is essential for our health, so that when having strong mitigation actions, we will have actions that will influence health positively or negatively, and Of course, the challenge is that these mitigation actions go in the right direction in terms of health and go in the right direction in terms of reduction of the social inequalities. And importantly, these health co-benefits will be on the short term, they will be local to a large extent, and they are not conditioned on other countries taking action. This is because if you ban a fraction of oil-powered cars in a city, air pollution, noise will be decreased very quickly, and health, to a large extent, will start improving on a short term. The quality of life and the well-being will be improved in the city, even if the other cities do not take any action against climate change. So these are local, short-term, unconditional benefits that are essential to be made visible. Within PARSEC, which is the research structure that we have started developing at IBENS, the Paris Research Center for Health and Climate Change, the way we structure this broad topic of climate change and health research is to highlight three key questions. The first one being the quantification of the impact of climate change, the cost of inaction, so to say, in terms of health. It is also important to compare the various mitigation scenarios in terms of their expected co-benefits in terms of health, in terms of impacts on the social inequalities. So you can see that as a scenario optimization exercise, if you want, comparing the potential sector-specific scenarios to try to point to society which one are expected to bring not only environmental benefits but health and social benefits. And in public health, we know very well that it's not enough to have a theoretical trajectory, theoretically relevant policy for society to embrace it and quickly change. So that a third and essential dimension of our projects that have currently not started, which rely on other approaches, relate to the identification of the obstacles to change and the identification of efficient ways to move forward. This can be done by thinking about policies or by doing intervention and field studies. And this is what will be covered in the third seminar by Lucille Marty from INRAE, who will give the example of intervention on changing the carbon footprint of diet and with possible health implications again. While the second question will in particular be discussed by Kevin Jean on October 7th. So if you try to translate these questions in terms of scientific challenges, you need to be able to quantify the long-term expected impact of climate change on health. Of course, similarly, the long-term and the short-term health impact of mitigation actions related to fossil fuel use, land use. This can be done by having some knowledge of the mediators of this impact. In the case of climate change, of course, temperature, other weather-related events such as extreme-related events related to precipitation and not only temperature. The large and huge and very complex world of infectious factors, fires, not to mention consequences related to flooding. There are similarly various pathways, rather different, related to the mitigation actions and related to air pollutants, physical activity, green space, exposure, changes in diet, etc. In this lecture, I will focus on a very limited part of all these, which is the connection between temperature and health on the short term as a building block, which is essential to go on the long term. And moving to the long term is something that will be illustrated in Kevin's talk next month. There are several approaches to quantify this short-term connection. Historically, the first one relies on heat wave studies. Another essential one is the time series design. which I will also discuss. And I will not spend time on a third important topic, which is more fundamental and experimental research. You can see it as, yes, experimental designs in humans and animals, in toxicology, physiopathology, to understand the underlying mechanisms of heat-related health effects. This is schematically a rather explanatory approach, while these population-based approaches are pretty blind in terms of underlying mechanisms, which is probably a part of the explanation of their efficiency. They don't bother with the fine-scale mechanisms, which is powerful, but of course doesn't provide any information on these mechanisms, which are various. You know physiologically that our body has to function keeping the temperature in a range between 36 and 38 degrees. If temperature increases, there are mechanisms, in particular vasodilatation, sweating, that allows to try to maintain temperature constant with more or less efficiency according to the age, the gender, the underlying diseases one may have. It's been also shown experimentally that if the environment is warm, the time before you get exhausted is inversely proportional to the initial body temperature, so that you can see a high external temperature as being equivalent to a strong exercise for the body, with resulting consequences, for example, for heart and respiratory system. As long as the body temperature is between 40 degrees, on the short term, the health is generally stable, but very serious problems happen if the body temperature is above 40, which is a temperature when proteins start to denaturate, leading to inactivation of the corresponding protein, to cell injury, to possibly cell death, and various effects on the cardiovascular and respiratory system, but also on the brain, kidneys, liver. So let's change scale and move from molecules to population, and start with the studies of heat wave, which are historically the first setting for this information on the effect of temperatures. There's a first issue that you know well, related to the fact that there is no unique definition of heat waves. The general definition is that it's a prolonged period of excessive heat. Now there are various thresholds as to what is first, which temperature indicator do you use. Most of the studies I will show are just plain temperature, but of course you have these indexes combining temperature and humidity. In terms of duration, thresholds of 2 to 6 days are often used. In terms of amplitude, it can be a percentile, such as the 90th or the 99th percentile, with respect to some historical average that may change actually across time. If I'm not wrong, the WMO has a definition of more than 5 consecutive days above, more than 5 degrees above the normal range taken from the 1960s to 1990. But basically, these definitions are really study specific. So the first reference to this issue is in Hippocrates, more than 2,000 years ago. But in the recent literature, probably one of the historical studies is this very simple study in New York that I will not detail, but based on 2 heat waves from 1972 and 73, in which authors from New York and London documented an increase in the number of deaths, also in the number of homicides, actually, which that they noticed that when you look at the death certificates in these periods, heat was mentioned as a possible underlying cause of death in only a fraction of them, so that other causes of death in terms of medical causes need to be considered. And they finally concluded that if such heat waves were to happen in a period with power supply failure, this would be an even larger impact, which is a way to refer to what you would call today maybe compound events. So this is very schematic in terms of methods, but actually all their intuitions and results from this abstract have been verified in the future using an approach which is methodologically very simple but very robust. You know, we are talking about observational studies. Observational study doesn't mean that there is no design. On the contrary, it means that you have to be very careful in the data collection so as to control the various bias that will result from the fact that you are in a non-controlled setting. There's a large history of such quasi-experimental studies in environmental epidemiology coming from the field of air pollution research, with the example of the Meuse Valley fogs or London smog 1952 episode, which basically consists in comparing mortality between a period where the environmental factor, air pollution or temperature, strongly decreased or strongly increased with a reference period in which it was strongly different. The decrease might correspond, for example, to the Utah Valley steel mill strike, which allowed to have lower particulate matter levels and in which improvements in health in the Utah Valley were clearly documented. Similar studies have been done during the Olympic Games, where traffic is generally decreased, or after the Dublin ban on bituminous coal, which led to improved particulate matter levels and cardiovascular death levels. There's also interesting studies after the German reunification, in which the Eastern German industry strongly decreased its emissions, leading to improved respiratory health in children. So you can transpose this approach for heat waves, and the typical result is this one, shown by this study from Inserm and Santé Publique France on the August 2003 heat wave. The gray bars show the difference between the observed number of deaths with the expected number of deaths, which I will explain, while the temperature levels are shown here. This is Tmax for the solid line. So it looks like a very strong short-term impact on mortality. There are various methodological challenges. I will be quick, but I have already alluded to the issue of the various definitions of heat waves. Of course, the intensity of the heat wave is related to its duration, so that if you count on the total number of deaths, of course, it's proportional to the heat wave intensity structurally, because you have just more days, so more opportunities for death. If you count in death rate and not death number, then the problem is avoided. Heat waves tend to occur at specific seasons, so that the control period cannot be any other period, but should ideally be at a similar season, where possibly infections and other factors influencing health are at the same prevalence. They may be accompanied by other weather-related phenomena. This is the Moscow heat wave in 2010. There were huge fires, so very high particulate matter levels simultaneously. In other situations, ozone, which influences air health, is also influenced. And then you have to be careful with the mortality statistics, which have various issues depending on the country. I won't go in the details, but they are not fragile, but very specific statistics that are a complex construction. So usually what is being done is to compare the number of deaths observed in a given period, which will extend beyond the heat wave, because all the deaths might not occur at once, and either subtract the observed the expected value from the observed one, or divide the observed value by the expected one. There is no reason to prefer one or the other. The consequences will be, the result, of course, will differ, possibly in terms of sensitive population. Of course, you should not restrict the number of deaths to the number of deaths for causes attributed to heat or to any other extreme weather event you are looking at, because doctors just don't know the cause of death. If you want to study tobacco smoking effects, you will not look for death certificates in which tobacco is written. It's just not written. If you look at air pollution effects, there's no way to look for air pollution-related death. It's this indirect approach that has to be used. The medical cause of death is a very proximal cause, and it doesn't inform on the more distal environmental cause. And regarding the expected value, ideally you would have, well, the number of deaths that would have happened at the same season in this population if everything besides the heat wave wouldn't have been there. One option is to take the same period 1 year before, or the average of the 10 previous years at the same months. This is still a challenge in the context of climate change because, of course, well, there's a trend in temperature, so that it's better to actually take also a reference period that will also include the future period, which means that you have to be patient before you provide these results. In this case, it was only compared to the period before, but it's better to have, of course, comparison periods encompassing the past and the future. If you look in the details, here is shown the difference between observed and expected deaths and their ratio. You see that indeed, in that case, in 2003, where the heat wave was visible, many doctors had mentioned dehydration, heat stroke, hypothermia on the death certificate, and many of the deaths attributed to the heat wave were related to these factors, as mentioned on the death certificate. In terms of ratio, this corresponds to a 20-fold increase compared to the reference period 1 year before. But you also see that there was an equivalent number of deaths because of circulatory system diseases, almost 1,000 deaths attributed to cancers, above 1,000 deaths attributed to respiratory system diseases. You have to keep in mind that the cause of death is not the proximal cause of death. It's supposed to be the underlying pathology that has led eventually to the death. There's a complex codification system. Aglaé?
There's only one cause of death on the death certificate.
On the death certificate, no. It's a narrative, and there's what is the most proximal cause? What may have caused this? One may have caused it. So they may say, oh, there's heart failure in the context of someone suffering from cancer. So it's a codification exercise which is done at the Inserm registry of medical causes of death. There's a whole algorithm developed by WHO. So you can have access to the main cause of death, which is a very remote cause, but you have also ancillary causes of death, which are generally not analyzed, but if someone is very courageous. It's the main cause of death, which is the rather remote cause of death. So that explains the neoplasms. You have someone fragile suffering from cancer. There's a heat stroke, which is another hit on his health that makes the death happen a bit earlier. So you even see an increase in the number of deaths by injury and poisoning. So that is consistent with the study showing more homicides in New York. We'll come back to that if we have time. And overall, an estimated excess of about 15,000, corresponding on this period to a 50% increase in this 3-week period in August. You might wonder who is more susceptible. You see here the effects across ages. 1.1 in terms of ratio below 35 years, 1.3 between 35 and 74, 1.7 above 75. So everyone is sensitive to temperature effects. with an amplitude that varies with age, and indeed the highest multiplicative effect is seen in people older than 95, 2.0, compared to 1.5 in the first year of 1.1, sorry, in the first year of life. But everyone is susceptible, and of course, you might want to weight this number of deaths by the remaining life expectancy, which is of course much longer for a 1-year-old child than for a 95-year-old person. So that's why I have these two questions. Who is most sensitive? You might prefer the multiplicative indicator. Who should be most protected? How to act to gain as large as possible number of deaths? Well, you might still prefer to act on in these age groups, 75 to 95. If you think as an economist in terms of life gains, of life years gained, you might prefer to act, or of course not to ignore the people between 35 and 75, because there's a huge impact in terms of life years lost. So this is just to illustrate the well-known fact that sensitivity is sensitive to whether you have an additive or multiplicative model, and whether you use death or life years or any other indicator. It would also be different with morbidity.
Is there a difference in level of protection which is expected for a 1-year-old, who's probably taking more care of at 25 years old? Is something that is modeled? Or
This is a non-explicative model. So this is the result of how people live, how their homes are, who is taking care of them. And of course, we know that we take a lot of care of the very young ones, and possibly not that much of the older ones. So this is the result. This is here. There's a few studies that looked at mortality, and it was shown that among the elderly, the death rate was much lower in the hospital, which might be because these people were efficiently taken care of. So you can indirectly look at the problem you are hinting to with such data, but it's not easy to have fine-scale data on a very large population sample, so you don't explain much with this, but it's already pretty informative. An important question is the lag in the effect of the heat wave. This is a multi-country study that tends to show that the impact of the heat wave does not extend beyond much more than 5 to 10 days, so to say. You see here in Italy, for reasons I could not explain again, the impact of the heat wave is still visible a week after the heat wave, while in Taiwan, after maybe 4 days, and the same for Australia, there is no residual impact on mortality. You might remember the debates after the 2003 heat wave. There is no decrease in mortality. There were people claiming after August 2003, oh, we will have a strong decrease in mortality at the end of the year. These were only very, very short-term effect. This is what is called harvesting in not very nice expression. This doesn't seem to be the case. And frequent question is the effect of the heat wave duration. As I've said, it's a bit tricky because, of course, the longer the heat wave, the longer the opportunity for a death. So you cannot count the number of deaths. This is a rather complex modeling exercise, but the authors try to distinguish. This is Antonio Gasparini from London. The authors try to distinguish if the heat wave impact was different from the sum of the impact of each day. And the simple, schematic answer, this is for the USA, is that no, there is not that much of an added effect of the heat wave. So 4 independent warm days lead to more or less, well, there's a small difference, but more or less the same number of deaths than a 4-day heat wave. That's for the US, and they see a small added effect, but it's not like a doubling in the impact. So I think it's really, it's an open question. I wanted to touch on the fact that it's not that clear because everyone is saying, well, the effects tend to add up and people don't get cooler and everything. This is the US, so that people have air conditioning in many areas, and I'm not aware of studies that did the same in Europe or in particular. Of course, we're talking about heat waves, but there are also effects of cold spells. I won't be long on this, but we'll come back again to that. Now, by doing these heat wave studies, we only focus on a small number of observations a couple of times, or every year, or every couple of years. We miss a lot of information, and of course it would be worth knowing whether it would be possible to extract information from the subtle variations in temperature and from the daily variations in mortality, which corresponds to the time series design, in which you would relate the number of deaths in a given community, say a city, on a day, to the temperature on the same day, or the day before, or the few weeks before this day. And you repeat this analysis for every day. Again, this is something that has been done with lots of success in air pollution research. At the end of the 1970s, people thought that due to the effort against air pollution in northern countries like the US, air pollution was not a problem anymore. Then came people like Joel Schwartz from Harvard and EPA, and he used this time series design that allowed him to take into account not only the peaks of air pollution, but the daily variations. And he showed continuous effects without any threshold for PM. This is the amount of information in this analysis is, as you can see, much more important, because you can use the whole year or series of tens of decades. While for heat waves, you have a few weeks every year or a couple of years, depending on the heat wave definition. So the result is typically this kind of dose response function. This is based on all death in France as obtained from Inserm Register of Medical Causes of Death from 1968 to 2016, relating temperature on a given day with from EOPS data with, let's say, a somewhat regional grid, with mortality in the following days and weeks. So relating temperature with mortality in the following days at the regional scale. And you have this U-shaped dose response function, which is typical, at least in Europe, with a minimum close to 20 degrees Celsius, and an increase that corresponds to a relative risk of death of about 1.5 if you are close to 30 degrees or close to -5 degrees. So it means if there's 1,000 deaths on a given day, if the temperature is 20, you expect 1,500 deaths if it's 30 degrees or -5. Again, this is not explanatory, and the underlying phenomena might be very different in the heat and cold. And this is a pretty robust association, even if there are lots of assumptions in this model, which I can detail here briefly. The time series analysis is if you want, a Poisson model of the number of deaths on a given day as a function of temperature on the same day. So xt would be the temperature on day t, plus the temperature and the temperature on day t-1, t-2, t-L, L being the maximum lag you consider. Adjusting for something here called S for spline function, which is a way to control for long-term trends in mortality that you want to get rid of, and that might not be due to temperature. To some extent, they might be due to temperature, but you cautiously take away the long-term trends in mortality. And you adjust for other ecological factors that are known to influence mortality rates, such as the day of the week. Fewer deaths on the difference between Sunday and other days. So the illustration of the lag is given here. You see that for the effects of warm temperatures, it doesn't look like there's a strong lag. We'll come back to that. So that the effect of temperature only in the few days before a given day seem to exist, and there is no memory of old, long temperatures. But you have to keep in mind that that approach is not meant to capture the effect of, let's say, the yearly temperature average. There are subtleties that I will not go to. Sorry?
On the result, there is a lag.
There is indeed a lag. So we can start with the warm temperatures. This is not the same data, but again, you see that there's a lag that goes maybe up to 5 days when it comes to the hot temperatures. It's not easy to see on this graph, but indeed from minus 5 days, clearly the slope starts to increase. For the cold, it seems that there is no immediate effect of cold. Here, this might be an artifact, the decrease on the cold day, but that the effect of the cold extends for a week or two possibly. So a longer lag for cold effects, which might be due to the fact that we're not looking at the same phenomenon. The effect of the cold might be due actually to infections, while the effect of the hot is probably a more physiological effect due to the exhaustion and the fact that the heart and the rest of the body have difficulties in coping with warmth. When it's cold, it's not that we have difficulties in coping with cold because we can put our clothes on. So that's this time series design. As I mentioned, there is this spline function for the long-term trends. These are the number of deaths on the long term over decades. You see these seasonal variations. They may or may not be due to temperature. They may be due to some effects of infections, but also of other factors. And you see possibly increasing or decreasing trends depending on the area, which will be very dependent on the health system, on the social factors that are not connected or not totally connected to temperature. So the cautious approach is to control them and take them away. So it doesn't mean that there's no long-term effect of temperature. It's just that this approach is not efficient in looking at them. It underestimates the impact. For air pollution, we've done the comparison, and it's clear that time series strongly underestimate the effect of PM on health compared to what cohort studies on the longer term would estimate. So it's biased, but in a direction that you know, which corresponds to an underestimation. As I've mentioned, if you have various cities, various centers, you have local temperatures, local mortality data, so that you use a two-stage modeling. This is what we have done here for France. Each curve corresponds to one region. So you have the region-specific model that was written in the previous slides, and then you have a second stage model that aggregates our region, possibly adjusting for region-specific characteristics, differences in latitude, differences in social characteristics, to obtain the country-wide estimate, which corresponds to the black curve. And you can study the heterogeneity between regions with this two-stage approach. Okay, so it's a very powerful design. People would think, and this is also done in epidemiology, not for temperature, why not compare various areas with various climate? So compare Kiruna in Sweden with Rhodes. Well, it's obvious. There are lots of differences between these two cities, the housing type, the indoor temperature for a given outdoor temperature, because it's clearly not the same architecture, smoking, alcohol consumption, diet, genetic characteristics, distribution of chronic diseases, that would confound the association between temperature and health. For us, a confounder is anything that is a common cause of both the exposure and the effect. If you compare Kiruna with Kiruna on another day, then all these factors do not vary, because the smoking rate, the alcohol consumption, at least it's the way it influences health, do not vary on a daily basis. It's the same population, so the genes are the same, the distribution of chronic diseases is the same, and you don't have to bother about it, you don't have to measure them. If you were to compare Kiruna and Rhodes, you would have to measure all these factors. The only thing that varies from day to day is the rate of infectious diseases, because they spread on a daily basis, but you have information on this so that you can include them in the model and control for them statistically. This is actually tricky because they're going to move Kiruna city. Because there's an iron mine, and so they have to move the city 3 kilometers away. So that would be a problem if they were really to make a time series analysis in this city. But I had taken this example some time ago. There are obvious assumptions behind this approach. One is that we are looking at the outdoor temperature. I didn't mention that, or maybe en passant, which is not the temperature our body perceives. This is an example of data showing on a population of I forgot, but a small population, the average indoor temperature throughout the year and the average outdoor temperature throughout the year in green. And you see, of course, that when it's cold outside, fortunately, it doesn't go down too low inside. Another way to look at it is at an individual basis. This is the outdoor level and the indoor level, and you see that when it's below 13 degrees, there is no association between the indoor and outdoor temperatures, while if temperature is above 13, 15, there is a correlation, which is not a one-to-one linear relation, but a correlation, which tends to show that at least when it's warm, the outdoor temperature is a good proxy. At least it's strongly correlated with the temperature perceived by the body. And it's really not the case for cold temperatures. You could do some fancy modeling with some measurement error model trying to transpose the consequences of this error on the exposure in the dose response functions I've shown. To my knowledge, it's not done. We have a study funded with colleagues from MIN that will try to go a bit into this. The fact is that all I've shown is based on the outdoor temperature. Again, you could expect, but I'm not sure this has been modeled, attenuation effect rather than a bias in the other direction, and certainly a strong increase in the uncertainty. I'm talking about short-term effects. Now you might want to know where the largest impact is. For me, the difference between an effect and impact is that the impact is the number of attributable death to a given factor. There are fewer very hot days, such as this one, than colder days, such as this one, where maybe it's 22 or 25. But of course, the effect of this given day is much stronger than the effect of this day. If you want the total impact on a yearly basis, you have to combine the amplitude of the effect on a given day with the number of days at which this temperature occurs, which is something that Kevin will touch more upon later. But basically, if you do that, and this is what Santé Publique France has done, the result for France in the recent period is that actually only 30% approximately of the heat-related death occur during heat waves. So that currently most of the death due to temperature are non-heat wave death. They are related with the fact that we have here a dose response function that doesn't have a threshold, that doesn't have like a sudden jump from a certain level, but rather a continuous curve. And these days between 21 and 30 degrees, which are non-heat wave days, are much more frequent than the heat wave days. So they correspond currently to the largest impact. So this is an analysis of the actual mortality and temperature data from 2014 to 2022. So indeed, you know this better than me, there's probably very few very strong heat waves. So that's for this period. If this had been done for the year 2003, the result would have been different. If this had been done for the 2000-2025 period, this would have been different. This is just to insist on the fact that the distribution of temperature plays a huge role, and that this value was certainly different in the past, and this is already quite a lot, 30%. I think if we were to do this analysis from the 50s to the 70s, it would be lower. And if you do that exercise around 2050, you may have a larger value, unless the definition of heat waves has changed so that you don't have that many heat waves in that period because you have a different reference. So this is just to insist on the importance of the distribution of the temperature. I agree with you that around 2003 it could have been different. So I plan to stop here, even if I have other things we could discuss. This was just to illustrate one specific approach, which is central to estimate the short-term effects of temperature on mortality. They don't explain much, as you know, which is not a problem for epidemiologists. We identified the effect of smoking, of air pollution, decades before we could understand how they influence. We don't totally explain the effect of smoking on health, but fortunately we can identify it even if we don't understand everything. There are other approaches. Cohorts can be used. I'm quoting here an interesting recent cohort study from Nature Climate Change in which they look at markers of biological aging. There are also there's the essential approach of health impact assessment to go on the longer term that Kevin will discuss next month. This is a probably biased approach, but pretty robust in a way, even if there is, contrarily to, I would say, temperature models that you can compare, GCM that you can compare to measured temperatures. There is no absolute reference to which you can compare these estimates of the attributable number of deaths associated to temperatures. These models pretty consistently show a pretty short lag for heat. Here I mentioned 1 day, but let's say 1 to 5 days, and a longer lag for cold effect, with a U-shaped association for all underlying causes of death, but for suicide, actually, which has a linear association, which I can discuss if you are interested. There are lots of visible and less visible assumptions in this time series modeling. The fact that we use external temperature as a proxy of personal exposure, the fact that we disregard the long-term effects of temperature, that these effects of temperature capture all the effect of all factors downstream of temperature. So if you consider that PM levels are a consequence of temperature, it's in the effect. If ozone is strongly related to temperature in summer, the effect of ozone will be included in the estimated effect. This is not a bias, you just have to keep it in mind. And of course it assumes that people don't change location on the short term when it starts to be warm, which is not true for everyone, but at least it shouldn't be true for a large number of people. So I will stop here. There are many other questions you may have. If you are short of questions, I have mentioned them. These are those for which I have a nice answer, but of course I don't want to limit you if we have time for questions. Biology and environmental effects tend to be continuous, even if we know that there are also non-continuous phenomena, and that societies, when they manage risk, like threshold, because it's much easier to say, oh, you are above, or because binary vision is simpler for everyone, and in particular for risk management. So that's one reason why you would have thresholds, and you could define the threshold as, well, the impact is beyond that level, yes, beyond that level. Now, this probably, the results, and I'm not certain here, possibly refer to approaches such as approaches by people from the ecological world who use the concept of a niche, looking at where species live and don't live. And this approach has been, I think it's Lenton and others, they have transposed this ecological approach to humans. So they have statistics showing that, well, in this given space defined by temperature levels, there are very few humans who ever lived. So they consider this as a niche where humans cannot survive. There are very interesting debates between the ecologists and epidemiologists as whether this niche concept is relevant for humans, because the human species is probably one of those that can adapt most for obvious reasons. We can live in a bubble for some time. So that I don't know if it's just a convenient graph or if you really can define well, you certainly can define a temperature where everyone would die on the rather long term, but it's, you can see, but certainly there's a management component to that, which is common. We've had to fight for air pollution where the association is linear, this concept of pollution peaks, because again, it's just like for here, most of the death related to PM do not happen when there's an air pollution peak, because the threshold is pretty high. Temperature pathophysiology is an area which is actually very little studied, with very few clinicians and very few experimental studies. So for cancer, they tend to have biological and molecular level models of cancer that they try to aggregate at the organ scale, at the individual scale, and then at the population scale. This goes to systems biology. This is, my view is just, it's very nice scientifically. I'm tempted to say, given the emergency of the problem, it's not where I would invest my energy, and I don't expect this to be very easy, because in the case of temperature, you also have to model all the societal factors. I mean, how well you are taken care of if you have a heart infarct. If you have a defibrillator in the room here, it's totally different than if you don't have one. So if you really want to model, to be able to model the impact on mortality, you not only have to model all that's inside the body, but the whole society, which is a nice attempt, but that I think is rather well invested in modeling the transport sector, the energy sector, and for mitigation strategies. So certainly people have simple models of that. How far they are is, but again, keeping in mind, yes, tobacco, we have identified more than 50 carcinogens in tobacco. You can explain maybe half of the tobacco-related death from these exposures, and it's much more simple than temperature, I would say.